So here are my answers to question 1. Part A, new trade agreement will lead to strong currencies in both countries. T, yields, D and Y. Fairly straightforward, I think, not controversial. Let's look at B. If the trade agreement is signed, a rise in the yen will result in a fall in the dollar. So if we have the trade agreement, then it follows that if the yen rises, the dollar falls. There's actually another way you could write that. You could say, well, there's two preconditions here. If the trade agreement is signed and if the yen rises, if those two things happen, then the dollar falls. And in fact, these two statements are logically equivalent. If you work out truth tables, you'll find out that the truth table for that is the same as the truth table for that. And for the last one, if there's a new trade agreement, then it follows that these two things are linked. One rises if and only if the other one rises. Another way to write that would be as follows. If the trade agreement is signed, then if the yen rises, the dollar rises, and if the dollar rises, the yen rises. And again, these are equivalent because in fact that thing is just an abbreviation for that thing. It means implication in both directions. Okay, well that takes care of number 1. Well, for number 2, I've put my answers in bold. If that doesn't show up on your screen, these are the ones that are in bold. Okay, I started with phi and I negated it, so true becomes false, true becomes false, false becomes true, false becomes true. I have psi. We've already worked out the truth table for the conditional, and we've seen it's T, F, T, T. Now we can take phi. Now we can take not phi and psi. We can combine these two columns with a disjunction to get this guy. So this will be true whenever one of these is true, which means one of them's true here, neither is true here, so we get a false. They're both true here, we get a true. One of them's true here, we get a true. So this column comes from combining these two with disjunction. And now we simply compare these two, and this is really getting to number 3. We can compare these two and observe that every entry is the same. And since the truth values are the same, the conclusion we can draw is that phi yields psi is equivalent to not phi or psi. And that takes care of 2 and of 3. Returning to number 4 now, we've got 4 columns to fill in. And again, I've written them in boldface, but you may not be able to see the boldface on your screen. But these are the 4 entries that I put. I began with the 2 columns that were given, the standard range of possibilities for T and F, for phi and psi. I negated the psi values to give me not psi, so T became an F, and F became a T, T to F, F to T. Then I wrote down the values for phi yields psi, which we know, we've already worked that out. It's T, F, T, T. Then I negated those to give me phi does not yield psi, so T becomes an F, F becomes T, T to F, T to F. And then I combined the first column with the third column using conjunction to give me this one. And with conjunction, you have to have both of them true to get a true. Well, we've got a T and an F, and that F means we're going to have an F there. Here we've got a T and a T, so I get a T there. Here I've got 2 F's, gives me an F. And here I've got 1 F, so I've also got an F. Well, that fills in all of the columns. And then to answer question 3, we just notice that these guys are all the same, and hence we may conclude that phi does not yield psi is equivalent to phi and not psi. And in fact, what I'd like to do now is just recall the discussion we had to obtain the truth table for phi yields psi. If you remember, to do that, we had to look at phi does not yield psi. In order to find the truth values in the case where phi was false, we ended up having to look at phi does not yield psi. And this truth table here sort of shines a light on what was going on. It illustrates, or it explains to us why looking at that enabled us to work out the two problematic truth values for the truth table for yields, for implication when phi was false. Because it's this equivalence that we were capitalizing on. That phi does not yield psi if phi is true and nevertheless psi is false. Okie dokie? Well, that's questions 4 and 5 for you. How did you do?